Hello everyone. Today everything turns on one quiet knock and one sentence that draws a line in the sand. I've come to stay with you for a few days. With Mrs. Huyen inside the home, Mr. Huan can't control the story in the shadows anymore. So what will he do when he realizes he's losing power? Stay with us and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The morning feels too quiet for a home that's been living under pressure. Diep stands in the kitchen with a glass of water she hasn't touched, eyes flicking to her phone on the counter like it might light up and change everything. Nai sits on the rug with her backpack half open, twisting the zipper back and forth, small hands repeating the same motion, because repetition feels like control. Jame is by the window, scanning the street below, not expecting to see anything obvious, just refusing to be surprised. In this house, silence doesn't mean peace. It means Mr. Huan is choosing his next move. Then the knock comes. 3 taps. Calm. Certain. Nai jolts, backpack slipping from her shoulder and thudding to the floor. Diep's breath catches. Jame is already moving. Quiet steps. Steady posture like fear doesn't get to set the tempo. He looks through the peephole. His shoulders shift. Just once. He opens the door. Mrs. Huyen stands in the hallway without bodyguards. No luxury car idling outside, no assistant hovering. Just a small bag in one hand and a look on her face that says she made a decision long before she arrived. She doesn't smile. She doesn't explain. She says one sentence and it lands like a shield dropped between them and the world. I've come to stay with you for a few days. Diep doesn't move. Her mind tries to call it a misunderstanding, tries to protect her from hope, but her throat tightens because she understands what this really means. Mr. Hoan didn't anticipate this. Diep is not alone anymore. Nai makes a small sound and runs straight into Diep, clinging to her waist like the room itself might tilt. Her fingers grip Diep's shirt. Her face presses into her stomach. It isn't just fear, it's memory. It's the part of her that learned safe can disappear in an afternoon. Mrs. Huyen notices and pauses. Her expression softens, but her body stays careful. Like a woman who has navigated boardrooms with ease but isn't sure how to hold a frightened child without breaking her trust. She crouches down slowly, bringing herself to knees level. Nai, she says gently. Come here. Nai doesn't move. Diep's voice is thin. She's scared. Mrs. Huyen nods once. She opens her arms, not forcing anything, just offering. I'm not here to take you anywhere, she tells Ni, voice quiet but firm. I'm here to keep you here. Ni's eyes flick up, sharp, searching. She looks at Diep like she's asking permission to believe. Mrs. Huyen reaches into her bag and pulls out something small, a simple stuffed bunny. No flashy brand, no performance, just soft. She holds it out. Nai hesitates, then takes it with both hands. Still half hidden behind Diep's legs. That tiny acceptance changes the air. Mrs. Huyen stands and steps inside. Jame closes the door behind her, but he doesn't lock it. For the first time in days, he doesn't feel like he needs to hide. Mrs. Huyen scans the apartment with a quiet kind of attention. The shoes lined by the door, the crayons on the rug, the sponsorship papers folded like they've been handled too many times. She doesn't ask questions yet. She sets her bag down. Then she walks straight into the kitchen, rolls up her sleeves, and asks Diep, "What do you have?" Diep blinks. "What?" "Food," Mrs. Huyen clarifies, already opening cabinets. "What do you have?" Diep's lips part, but no words come, because she expected judgment or interrogation or a lecture. Instead, Mrs. Huyen is acting like a mother in a home that needs mothering. She finds rice, eggs, vegetables. She turns on the stove. The click of the burner feels like something returning to life. Nai sits at the table with her bunny watching Mrs. Huyen like she's studying a new character in a story she doesn't trust yet. Mrs. Huyen places a small plate in front of her first. No announcement, no show. Just instinct. Nai stares, then eats. Slowly, but she eats. Diep turns away and the tears hit so fast she barely has time to cover her mouth. Jame sees it, and something shifts in him. Relief mixed with disbelief. He's never seen his mother move like this without an audience. After breakfast, Mrs. Huyen cleans without being asked, wipes the counter, picks up crayons and arranges them in a cup, smooths the blanket on the couch. Small actions that say the same thing. I'm here, and you are not carrying this alone. By late morning, Nai finally lets Mrs. Huyen brush her hair. It's clumsy. Mrs. Huyen fumbles with the tie. Nai winces. Sorry, Mrs. Huyen says quickly. Human, unpolished. Nai looks at her, then nods. It's okay. That's not full trust, but it's a bridge. Diep stands in the hallway watching, arms wrapped around herself. Her voice trembles. I'm sorry. Mrs. Huyen turns. For what? For causing chaos, Diep whispers. For making Jame choose. For making the family ugly. Mrs. Huyen walks toward her slowly. Not dramatic, just steady. She takes Diep's hand, grip firm and warm. No, she says. Diep's breath shakes. No? Mrs. Huyen holds her gaze. No, I'm just being a real mother. The sentence cracks something open in Diep's chest. She doesn't cry politely. She breaks, shoulders folding, all the weeks of holding it in spilling out at once. Mrs. Huyen doesn't let go. Her embrace is a little stiff, a little awkward, but solid, real, present. When Ni finally naps, Mrs. Huyen sits at the table with Diep and Jame. Her tone is gentle, but her eyes are sharp. That day, she asks, when Ni was held, how long? Diep's fingers clutch her cup. She swallows. 3, maybe 4 hours. It felt like a lifetime. Diep tells her the rest. The school saying it looked normal. The lack of cameras. The messages afterward that didn't scream, but still cut. The cold sense of being watched. She tells her how she tried to keep Ni from feeling it. How she lied with a smile. How her heart never stopped racing. Mrs. Huyen listens without interrupting. No gasp. No tears. Just silence that feels heavy with focus. When Diep finishes, Mrs. Huyen looks down at her hands for a moment, as if she's seeing something old. Then she speaks quietly. He did the same thing to Jame. Jame stiffens. Mom. Mrs. Huyen lifts her eyes to him. The only difference, she says, is that on that day, no one protected the boy. Diep's breath catches. What do you mean? Mrs. Huyen's voice stays controlled, but there's an ache under it. Your father believed fear made children strong, pressure built character, silence taught obedience. He called it discipline. Her jaw tightens once. And he convinced himself it was love. James' eyes harden, but the wound underneath them is visible. Diep realizes, suddenly, painfully, that Mr. Hoan didn't invent this cruelty for her. He has been practicing it. For years. Diep whispers, so he didn't just hurt me. Mrs. Huyen shakes her head. No. He has been hurting his own child for a long time. He just found a new target that would force compliance faster. James' gaze drops. His voice is rough. I thought I was over it. Mrs. Huyen's reply is soft, but firm. You don't get over wounds that were never acknowledged. The room goes quiet, but it isn't empty. It's full of truth settling into place. Then Mrs. Huyen turns back to Diep, voice gentler now, but steady like instruction. "Don't disappear," she says. Diep blinks. "What?" "Don't sacrifice anymore," Mrs. Huyen repeats. "If you leave, he will win forever." Diep's eyes sting. "But if I stay, he'll keep targeting Nai." Mrs. Huyen nods. "That's why we change the battlefield." James straightens. "How?" "Don't sue. Not yet," Mrs. Huyen says. "And don't confront him directly the way he expects." Diep frowns. "Then what do we do?" Mrs. Huyen's expression turns strategic. "We bring everything to light inside the family." "Yes," she continues. "Your father thrives in secrecy. Everyone calls it private and uses that word like a shield." Her voice sharpens. "We remove privacy." Diep's stomach twists. "How?" "We gather the truth," Mrs. Huyen replies. "Messages, timelines, what he did with the school, the contract, the internal note Jame found. All of it. Then we put it on the table where his family can see it." Diep's voice trembles. "And you're staying here to make sure he can't isolate you again," Mrs. Huyen finishes. "To make sure he can't turn this into a girl manipulating my son. You will not be framed alone." James' voice is low, almost stunned. "You're taking our side." Mrs. Huyen meets his gaze. "This time, I'm not protecting my son," she says calmly. James' throat tightens. "I'm protecting what's right," Mrs. Huyen finishes. That line lands like a moral earthquake. Because Mr. Hoan has treated right like property for years, something he defines and weaponizes. That evening, she moves her things into the spare space like she belongs there. No fuss, no drama. She helps Nai eat dinner. Reads a bedtime story with a voice that starts stiff and becomes softer by the third page. Nai yawns and whispers, "Are you staying tomorrow too?" Mrs. Huyen pauses. "Yes." Nai hugs the bunny. "Okay." And for the first time in days, she sleeps without waking up twice. In the living room, Jame watches his mother pull a blanket over Nai's shoulders. He whispers to Diep, almost like he's confessing something he didn't know he had. "I've never seen Mom take sides like this." Diep's eyes are wet. "Me neither." Mrs. Huyen hears him anyway. She walks over and places a hand on James' shoulder, brief, firm, grounding. "Because this time," she says, "I'm not choosing sides like a family argument." James looks up. "I'm choosing conscience," Mrs. Huyen continues. "Your father is not asking for loyalty. He's asking you to betray what you know is right." A beat. "And I will not teach you to do that," she says. Mrs. Huyen pulls out her phone. Diep's heart jumps. "I'm ending his illusion," Mrs. Huyen says calmly. She dials. The call rings twice. Then Mr. Huan's voice appears. Cool. Controlled. "What is it?" Mrs. Huyen doesn't waste words. "I'm with the children," she says. Silence. Then, slower, "Huyen." Mrs. Huyen's face doesn't change. "He doesn't need to look," she adds. "He doesn't need to check. I'm telling you." Mr. Huan's voice hardens. "You think you can—" "I'm not asking," Mrs. Huyen cuts in, clean and quiet. "I'm informing you." The line goes dead. Mr. Huan hangs up. But the point was never to keep him on the phone. The point was to mark the shift. He no longer controls what happens inside his own family. After the call, the apartment feels different. Not safe. Not yet. But steadier. Diep leans against the counter, trying to breathe through the strange feeling of being protected without having to beg for it. James stands beside her, watching his mother move through the apartment like an anchor. Diep whispers, "What if this makes him escalate?" Mrs. Huyen hears and turns her head slightly. "He escalates when he thinks no one is watching," she says. "He escalates in secret." Her eyes meet Diep's. "So, we remove the secret." Diep swallows. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Mrs. Huyen steps closer. Her voice softens, not into comfort, into truth. You don't have to be strong alone, she says. You only have to stay. Diep looks toward Ni's room and feels the old reflex rise, the urge to run, to disappear, to sacrifice herself so the pressure stops. But Mrs. Huyen's words are still in the air. If you leave, he wins forever. Diep whispers, almost to herself. If I leave, he wins. Mrs. Huyen nods. Yes, Diep's chest aches. But if I stay, the family might break. Mrs. Huyen's expression softens. Sometimes a family has to break open, she says, so truth can breathe. The room falls quiet again. Not the quiet of fear, the quiet before a plan. Diep stares at the floor, then lifts her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she feels something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Permission. Permission to keep living. Permission to keep fighting. Not for revenge. For Ni. For what's right. And still, the question hangs over her like the last beat the episode can't answer yet. Now that Diep is protected for the first time, now that there is an ally inside Mr. Hoan's own home, will she choose to keep fighting, even if it shakes the family to its foundation? Or will she retreat to save the family, even if it means Mr. Huan wins forever? Because one thing is certain. A man like Mr. Huan is never more dangerous than the moment he realizes he's losing control at home.
Bị xem xét, hợp đồng bị hủy và Nhi đứng trước nguy cơ mất quyền trên trường. Trong lúc tưởng như không còn lối thoát, Jame âm thầm lần theo dấu vết phát hiện một tài liệu nội bộ chỉ chứng cho thấy ông đã can thiệp trái phép. Jame không kiện ngay mà gửi cho cha một email duy nhất. Anh đã bắt đầu tự bảo vệ mình, phản ứng đến lập tức. Tài khoản được mở lại nhưng hợp đồng bị xóa sổ. Thế cân bằng quyền lực bắt đầu thay đổi. Jame thừa nhận nỗi sợ, nhưng quyết đứng lên để Nhi không còn là con tin. Cuộc đối đầu không còn một chiều và câu hỏi lớn được đặt ra: ai sẽ là người phải trả giá trước?